Maybe I do. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. And without too much further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Babson, who is going to be speaking on Sky Islands this evening.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you all very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be speaking to you. I've been part of the training of our Pima County Master Naturalists since we started up, I think it was 4 years ago. And yeah, we had the COVID cohort, and I applaud everyone who managed to get through that. To be honest with you, that was a challenge. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. Can everyone see it?
Yeah.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, and good. So I sent the crew a list of 3 topics to speak about this evening, and they decided a talk on the Sky Islands would be good. So that's what we're going to talk about. And so we're going to talk about, you know, what is the definition of a sky island, and we'll talk about the different habitats, because that's why they're so biologically diverse. You have different species replace each other as you head up these mountains, and as you get closer to the Mexican border, you get some of these what we would call sort of exotic species, like a jaguar, for example, that are basically following these mountains up from Mexico into southern Arizona and extreme southwestern New Mexico. And so because of that, we get people from literally all over the world come here to visit us. Many of them actually fly into Sky Harbor, and they get in their rental cars and they'll make a tour of the southeastern corner of the state. And then they'll, when they want to get some culture, they head back to Phoenix and they get some culture, then they kind of go back to wherever they're from. So this is, if you have a question, just go ahead and ask it. That's perfectly fine with me if you want to do it that way. So what are the Sky Islands? Well, the short definition is they're mountain islands surrounded by a sea of desert. And what that means is, think of an island in the ocean where the animals and plants on that island are completely cut off from other animals and plants because of the ocean. The same thing happens here, except the sea, the quote unquote sea, is desert. And so if you live at the top of these mountains, the habitat down here in the valleys is largely unsuitable for you. So they literally are stranded up there on the top of the mountains. And so you have habitats like at the very top of some of these mountains, if they get high enough, you have these mixed coniferous forests with firs and pines and spruces that the nearest population of those plants are at the top of the closest Sky Island range that gets high enough to have them. So they really are kind of stranded. And what you end up with, like I mentioned before, you get a very high diversity of both plants and animals. In the Catalina Mountains, which are some of you may have been in the Catalinas, they're a big mountain range just north of Tucson, most of which burned this year. There are over 1,500 plant species recorded just in that mountain range alone. So, and then with that many plants, you have a corresponding increase in animal diversity as well. So that's just an example. And like I said, as you get closer to the border with Mexico, you get some more tropical plants and animals come in. The name Sky Islands was coined in 1943 by a journalist named Nat Dodge, who wrote an article on Arizona highways. I didn't even know Arizona highways was around in 1943, but apparently they were, and this journalist used the term in his article, but it didn't really catch on in the public vernacular until 1967, when a gentleman named Weldon Heald wrote a book called Sky Island, and that's sort of when that term began to enter the public sort of consciousness. And basically ever since then, you know, a lot of people will use the term Sky Island ranges to talk about all of the mountains that fit that category. So in between northern Mexico and the Colorado Plateau, there are about 65 mountain ranges that qualify as sky islands. And essentially, they're forming these stepping stones between those two geological features. The Colorado Plateau, because of its elevation and latitude, is quite different from the Sierra Madre Occidental, which is the western half of the Sierra Madre in northwestern Mexico. So there aren't all that many animals or plants that you can find in both of those areas. And so some things have been able to use stepping stones to get from one to the other. But the key thing, I think, for today's talk and to remember going forward is the fact that they are surrounded by inhospitable habitat. So if you were a Douglas fir up in the mountains and someone planted you in the desert, first of all, unless they gave you a whole bunch of water, you're not going to make it. It's not the right habitat for you. And of those 65 mountain ranges, 32 of them are north of the Mexican border. And they stretch in the south from the Patagonia, Huachuca, and Peloncillo Mountains, which those are straddling the border with Mexico. The Peloncillos also straddle the border with Arizona and New Mexico, up to the Superstitions, Pinals, and Santa Teresa's. Those last three are the ranges that are closest to Phoenix. And so, as you can see, not too terribly far away from where you're sitting right now, you have access to some of these Sky Island ranges. And here's a map. This map is kind of a mess in a way. It looks like somebody kind of threw up on it. But so you have Phoenix up here, you know, obviously the big metropolitan area in the state. And so the Superstitions are right here. So not too terribly far. Superstitions are an amazing mountain range. They're beautiful. Down here, these are the Pinal Mountains. Over here, you start to get into the Santa Teresa's. Down here, the Galleros. This map is out of a book. I sent Kim, I got so excited I was putting a couple of references together. I got so excited I sent the email before I finished typing it up. But if you want a very good introduction, there's this book called The Natural History of the Santa Catalina Mountains, with an introduction to the Madrean Sky Islands, because that's another name for these, the Madrean Archipelago or the Madrean Sky Islands. It's a very, very good basic introduction to these mountain ranges. And there's also one by David Brown, who the editor is David Brown, called Biotic Communities of the Southwestern United States and Northwestern Mexico. That's if you really want to take a deep dive into the subject. That book came out in the early mid-90s, and a lot of the plant names have changed as far as, you know, what genus they're in, but it's still just packed with information that'll kind of make your head explode. But so here, down in this area, here you got the Sierra Madre here, and up here is the Colorado Plateau. And right between them is a very thin transition area called the transition zone, which basically stretches from like the Bradshaw Mountains down sort of to the southwest, or I'm sorry, southeast. And so basically, when you get to the Mogollon Rim, you're basically, that's the base of the Colorado Plateau. And so a lot of the things to the north are more similar to things we see in the Rocky Mountains and further north on the Colorado Plateau, whereas to the south, things tend to be more similar to the Sierra Madre. So then we get the Chihuahuan Desert over here, and then the Sonoran Desert over here. And so what you do is you put those four big things together, those big sort of habitat, if you want to use that word, or biomes, and you end up with an incredibly diverse section of the country, especially when we consider the fact that we have no seacoast. There's a seacoast not terribly far from us in the Sea of Cortez and Sonora, but we have diversity right up there with many, if not the highest in the United States, but very close. And most of those states, like California, California is a very diverse state. biologically. Texas is a very diverse state biologically, but just think they have so much coastline that kind of helps them out a little bit. We don't have that. So we're a big, I kind of think of southeastern Arizona as a big melting pot, because we have the Chihuahuan Desert, Sonoran Desert, Sierra Madre, and Rocky Mountains / Colorado Plateau all coming together in one spot. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about a concept called life zones. And this is useful because this is what you encounter as you drive up or hike up the Sky Island ranges. So the idea for the life zones came from a study that this brilliant gentleman named C. Hart Merriam conducted in 1889, and he did that in the San Francisco Peaks, which are too far north to be considered part of the Sky Islands, but his classification of the plant communities that he found there is reminiscent of what we have here. And so the basic idea is, if you walk from Phoenix to the top, I mean, if you walk from Phoenix to the top of like some of these mountain ranges, would be akin to walking from the Mexican border to the Canadian border. Things change that much in a very short period of time. And we're lucky here in Tucson because we can go from the base of the Catalinas to the top in about an hour, which would be like, again, walking from the Mexican border to the Canadian border. So the plants and animals at the top of these Sky Island ranges are what you'd see like in Montana or British Columbia or something like that. Whereas the things at the base are much more similar to things we would find in Mexico. And I'm gonna show you what these life zones are in just a second. So Merriam did that in 1889. More recently, a brilliant ecologist named Forrest Shreve published a series of papers that have become classics in ecology. The first one came out in 1915, and they came out over a period of years. But he basically looked at the Sky Island ranges as ranges by themselves. And he did sort of the similar thing that Merriam did with the San Francisco Peaks. And he was a pretty astute guy. So he predicted back in the early 1900s that the Catalinas, which by the way, he had to explore on horseback because there were no roads or anything back then. He was the dude. He was a rock star. Anyway, he estimated that back in the early 1900s that there would be about 1,500 species of plant found in the Catalinas, and that's right about exactly where we are right now. So not only was he a rock star, he was also a very smart guy. And what makes these life zones, what changes them, and why we get this Mexican border at the bottom and Canadian border at the top has a lot to do with the weather, specifically temperature and especially precipitation. So in the Sky Island ranges, for every 1,000 feet of elevation gain, temperatures drop about 4 degrees and precipitation increases about 4.5 degrees. So to put that in a more realistic context, the top of Mount Lemmon, which is the mountain right outside Tucson, and I hate to use Tucson as the example for this. You have to excuse me for that. But the top of Mount Lemmon gets 30 or more inches of rain every year, rain and snow, whereas Tucson gets about 12 to 14 inches. And so that's the plants at the top cannot handle the heat down here, and the plants at the bottom can't handle the heat up top. And each one of those plant communities has their animal species that are a part of it and dependent upon those plant communities. So that's why the plants are so important. A lot of the habitats and ecosystems and such are often based on plants first, and then we then extrapolate that we start to say, well, these certain animals are found with these plants, and it may not have anything to do with the plants as far as them using the plant for like food or anything like that, but certain plants are found together, and with those plants, certain animals are found together. So it's a pretty dynamic system. But if you look in like an ecology textbook, it usually talks about plant communities and not animal communities. Okay, so here's an example. This is taken from that Brown book I mentioned. And so the life zone names are in the dashed zone lines on the left, like Lower Sonoran, which is what we have here in Tucson and up in Phoenix. Basically the low valleys where we see things like cholla, cacti, saguaros, prickly pear, mesquite, all that sort of stuff. That's the Lower Sonoran zone. The Upper Sonoran zone is also, the habitat is often called Madrean evergreen woodland. You start to get oaks and junipers, for example, at that stage. Then you get up higher, the transition zone, which is lots of pines and other conifers, and the Canadian zone is at the top of our ranges. We don't get really high enough for the highest zone, which is called the Hudsonian, named after Hudson Bay, which is up in Canada, and it's a very chilly place, and I really would probably be okay if I never visited there. But this is what when we talk about the life zones, these are the things on the left, Lower Sonoran, Upper Sonoran, Transition, Canadian. That's what Miriam came up with. The names inside the mountain here are more based on the actual habitats that we see. And to be honest, ecologists now are starting to get away from the life zone concept. They seem to think it oversimplifies things to some degree, but it's still used, you know, a lot. It makes it easy to sort of comprehend what we're talking about. And by the way, this is a southern exposure, so this is the habitats that you would see on the south side of a mountain. And then you'll notice when we go to this slide, this is the north zone. It's different. So you get up high enough, you get to the Hudsonian zone, and then the Arctic alpine, which is what we see, that's above tree line, basically. So the very top of the San Francisco peaks, many of the mountains we see like in Utah and Colorado and Wyoming and Montana fit that bill. But then as you go further north, the elevation drops down, but you get to the Arctic tundra, which is, you know, Alaska and northern Canada. And it's the same basic, maybe not the same species of plant, but same families and genera of plants that you see on the top of the mountains in the Rockies are similar to the ones you see up in the Arctic zone. So this is, it's a great simplification, but hopefully it's something that will help you visualize what we're talking about. And let's get to some real examples. So this is probably a landscape that you're familiar with up there. This is that Lower Sonoran zone with saguaros and prickly pears and chollas and mesquites and ocotillos and palo verdes. This is the one that we're all very familiar with, probably, that you probably learned a lot about when you were taking the class and in other sort of reading and stuff that you've done. But this is the, you know, it's hotter than blazes right now. And even in the wintertime, it gets cold, but not like Wisconsin cold. If it gets cold, it's only for usually a few hours at the most. So what that means is most of these plants are not particularly cold tolerant. They can handle cold weather for a while, but if it's going to be cold for 2 or 3 or 4 days, a lot of these plants are going to suffer, and some of the individual plants may die. So this is where we're starting to get an Upper Sonoran zone. This is on a south slope of the Catalina Mountains. If you've been in the Catalinas and you know where Molino Basin is, this is sort of right where we're looking at. But you start to have, you got some oaks starting in, you got some junipers up here. These are shrubs. You got some chollas down here. So, but this is the reason why the south facing, well, actually, before I say that, let me show you the north. So this is looking south, then I just turned around. And this slide was the next. This is the same view, but this is a north facing slope. So a lot more vegetation. The vegetation itself is a little bit lusher, a lot more green on the north facing slope. And that is because north facing slopes don't have as much solar radiation, so they're not getting as hot. And that also ties in when they do get rainfall, the moisture tends to seep down in the soil more as opposed to evaporating more quickly on the south facing slope. So the north and south facing slopes of the same valley can look quite different from each other, even though the plant species elevationally are going to be pretty much the same. It's the numbers that are going to be different. And so another name for this habitat is called the encinal. You hear that sometimes. A lot of people will just call it like an oak juniper woodland. And the woodland, if you don't know, is different from a forest, because woodlands, there's lots of space between the trees, essentially. Whereas a forest, the trees are more close together. So it's a little bit hard to sort of walk around in a forest and not bump into trees, whereas in a woodland, it's pretty easy. So going up a little bit higher, we get into this. This is in the Santa Rita Mountains, actually. We have alligator juniper over here, and these are other junipers. We got some oaks right here. But again, now we see more tree growth. This is a little bit higher up, a little bit more precipitation, a little bit cooler in the summertime. Start to see some, yuccas, Arizona yucca right here. And so this is going to have just, we're talking maybe a few hundred feet elevation. This is going to have different habitat in it, or different animals in it than the Sonoran zone. So for example, cactus wrens, the state bird, everyone's probably familiar with this. You won't see cactus wrens up here. There are cactus, there are prickly pear, there are some cholla, but you won't see cactus wrens. They're replaced sort of elevationally by another bird, sort of like a Buick's wren or something like that. And so again, same basic block kind of grid of size, but as we're going up, the species diversity is increasing, because saguaros, it gets too cold at this elevation for saguaros. So they're not there anymore. You get other things replace it. I mean, it still gets pretty hot in the summertime here, but it's not as hot as what we have in the valleys. Going up a little bit higher, now you start, not by this elevation, this is also in the Santa Ritas. By now, the junipers have largely dropped out, except for perhaps a few on the south-facing slopes. There's still oaks. Most of these deciduous trees, actually, our oaks are mostly evergreen, but these are mostly oaks. These are sycamores here with the white bark, but then these are the pine. It's like Apache pine. And so these zones there's not like a line and you step over that line and you go from one to the other. They blend together. And ecologists call that an ecotone. And if you were a biologist or a naturalist and you wanted to go do surveys and try to get as many species as possible, a good way to do that is go to an ecotone, because each habitat brings its own species with it and they're in the same area. So you kind of get double what you would have otherwise. So again, these are Apache pines, lots of oaks. The oaks are usually things like silverleaf oak, netleaf oak, emery oak, things of that nature. Then as we continue our little hike up by now we're probably hot and sweaty, but if we make it to the top, this is at the top of the Chiricahuas. This is in a place called Barfoot Park. And so now many of the oaks have dropped out. The oaks up here, if there's any, is going to be gamble oak. They're a deciduous tree. They shed their leaves in the fall, but you have Douglas fir, you have ponderosa pine, you have little spruces growing like white spruce, things like that. Lots of sneezeweed, which are these aster family plants. And so what you end up with is this area gets a lot of snow. Even in southern Arizona, it gets quite a bit of snow, sometimes measured in a couple of feet. The top of the Catalinas have this habitat, or I should say, for the most part, had this habitat, because a lot of this is gone from the Catalinas at the moment. But these are the trees that really can't survive down lower elevations. Douglas fir actually starts fairly about mid elevation, but these spruces, think of a Christmas tree or a fir. They don't like it cool. They don't like it hot. They like it nice and cool. And so not all of the Sky Island ranges have this habitat. It just doesn't get high enough for this sometimes. So the Chiricahuas, which if you've never been to the Chiricahuas, you need to go, because they're a fantastic mountain range. The Pinaleños, which is where Mount Graham is, gets this high. The Catalinas get this high, but something like the Superstitions, the Pinals, they don't get this high. So how high the mountain ranges are will sort of determine which habitat is at the top of the mountains. And then sort of bisecting all of this stuff, you get riparian habitats, which are these sort of mountain drainages that bisect all this stuff. And this is where the snow melt goes, and this is where the rainfall drains out of the mountains. This is where you have things like sycamore trees, Arizona sycamores, Fremont cottonwoods, Arizona ash, Arizona walnut, things like that. So it's a very narrow, linear type of habitat, but it's still different. Obviously, if you were an aquatic beetle, you're going to be in the stream. You're not going to be up on the hillsides in the oaks or junipers. So this is yet another habitat within these Sky Island ranges, and brings their own suite of species with them. So again, increasing that biodiversity. So let's talk about, there's a few, the next few slides are going to be how, sort of illustrating how things replace each other. So here we have the mule deer. This is the common deer we have in the desert valleys. They have those really big ears. I mean, they can pick up WKRP in Cincinnati. That some of you may not even know what that is. That was a sitcom back when I was in high school. Anyway, this is the deer. They have a higher heat tolerance. They're a little bit more efficient with their digestion, so they're not as dependent on getting freestanding water as much. I mean, they'll certainly need to drink, but they're just more desert adapted, and they tend to be sort of grayish as opposed to brownish. But if you go up to sort of where that oak juniper woodland starts, you really don't encounter many mule deer anymore. You get the whitetails. And from there almost to the top of the mountains, you'll get white-tailed deer. So again, within a really short distance elevationally, we get two species, whereas if it was all the same elevation, we'd only have one. And depending on what elevation that is, would determine which species of deer we have. And there could very well be some competition. The white-tailed deer may be preventing the mule deer from moving up. Not that they're battling each other, but maybe the white-tailed deer are what's called competitive exclusion. That's a big fancy term that ecologists use. That they might outcompete the mule deer at slightly higher elevations. Or it could be the other way too. The mule deer might outcompete the white-tailed at lower elevations, and that's why the white-tails aren't in the valleys all that often. However, it's not a universal. White-tailed deer, and we've seen it here with our desert bighorn. There were Arizona Game and Fish reintroduced desert bighorn to the Catalinas 3 or 4 years ago. And since then, we've actually have photos of desert bighorn using washes that drain the Catalinas, and they're walking between mountain ranges. And so that's how these animals disperse. Obviously they can't fly. So they have to, if they want to keep the gene pool mixing, and if one habitat kind of gets filled with individuals of a particular species, then some of those individuals have to leave. Otherwise they might starve to death, or things probably won't go very well. So white-tailed deer, even though we say they're a little bit higher elevation, that does not necessarily mean we are not going to see them in the valleys. We just typically don't. And so the desert washes are basically biological highways, at least for animals. Another example, I'm kind of a bird guy in a way. I mean, I kind of like everything, but I do a lot of bird stuff. So there's a fair number of bird slides in this. And so if you don't like birds, I apologize. Just focus on the other slides, I guess. But we get the same situation this is a bird called Buick's wren. This one you can see, bouncing around in mesquite trees. You can also see them as you get up into the oak juniper woodland. So compared to a mule deer, a little bit more of a habitat tolerance, perhaps. But then as you continue to go higher, the Buick's wrens drop out. Right around the area where you start to see pines, the house wren is the more common species. House wrens will winter down in the valleys, but and that's largely because of the lack of food. If you eat insects and spider eggs and things like that, and you're up in the mountains, it gets to be November, December, not as many insects around, and probably not enough for you to survive the winter. So what you have to do is you have to go where the food is. So in the winter time, you occasionally can see house wren and Bewick's wren in the same spot, but for breeding, they don't overlap for the most part. So again, one species, and you can go even further. Cactus wrens overlap with Bewick's wrens, but they do not overlap with house wrens. Cactus wrens are much bigger. They're kind of a different bird altogether in some ways, but that's the owls. Everybody loves owls. We have to throw some owls in there. So the western screech owl, this is the small backyard owl in most of southeastern Arizona. And when I say southeastern, just so you know, I'm including Phoenix in that. I know you guys might be considered more central. You guys are, in my mind, are part of southeastern Arizona as well. So this is one, if you have saguaros, if you have mesquites, if you have all that sort of stuff that we normally associate with the Sonoran Desert, you could very likely have western screech owls in your backyard. And that would be really cool if you do. They fledge their young. You might see family groups flying around. If you go out, they're not going to be making much noise right now. They get pretty quiet this time of year, but you might get to see them. Then if you go right around 4,500, 5,000 feet elevation is where this guy, the whiskered screech owl, takes over. And when you look at them, they kind of look like exactly the same thing. And they're pretty. These guys don't make it all the way to Phoenix, I'm sorry to say, because they're just delightful little birds. They're about the same size, maybe a tad smaller than a western screech owl. But if you look at these two, they look very similar to each other. They're both grayish birds with big yellow eyes and black streaks on them, and they look very similar. The thing with nocturnal birds, and birds in general, but nocturnal birds in particular, because they can't see. I mean, they can see, but they can't see color. So that's where sound becomes very important for them, and they recognize each other by sound. The two songs of the two owls are very, very different, and that's how they recognize each other in the dark. But you can tell them apart if you just look at them. If you're lucky enough to see them like at this time of year or during the daytime when they tend not to make any noise, a good way to tell the two species apart is to look at the bill. Western screech owls have a dark bill. Whiskered screech owls have a pale bill. Sometimes people try to outthink the room a little bit. They try to, I got to figure this out. It's really pretty simple. And if you are out there and you're hearing a western screech owl call and you see a little owl fly by, it's not a whisker, because they could care less really about the westerns. They do overlap. There is a slight overlap, but the whiskers are much more common where you start to see the pines start to enter the oaks. So typically they're more common above the elevation where westerns are more common. So, and it kind of cracks me up, just as an aside, that a lot of field guides mention that the whiskered screech owl has smaller feet than the western screech owl does, which it is factual. That is correct. But I don't know why the hell that's in anybody's notes, because remember, you're standing there in the dark, and the question has never come up: how big are its feet? It's so like if some person put it in a book once and everybody just keeps repeating it. So the small pale bill is a better way to tell them apart. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some birds that you're probably familiar with. We're going to kind of go through animals and some plants as we go up from lower Sonoran zone up the mountain. So Gambel's quail, the backyard quail, everyone's hopefully familiar with this bird with the fancy little crest on its head. And they're delightful. You may be seeing, or probably have seen for several months now, the family groups with all the little ones flying. Not swimming, but moving around. They should be pretty good sized by now. The greater roadrunner, which is, first of all, hopefully you know this, it does not say meep meep. It sounds more like a dove or an owl. I don't know where Warner Brothers and Bugs Bunny got that, but it doesn't make any sounds anything like that. A big ground-dwelling cuckoo is basically what it is. In fact, the scientific name, the genus name, Geocossix, that actually means ground cuckoo or earth cuckoo. You're not going to see these guys up in the mountains. Maybe where you start to see the mesquites entwining with the oaks, perhaps you can see them there, but this is a valley species for sure. Oh, I want to mention this. If you don't like snakes, the next slide is a snake. Because I say that because my mother, there's a picture on TV and she freaks out. I'm like, what is that all about? But in case anybody shares that, the next one's going to be a snake. So here's the Western diamondback. This is the very common, very widespread desert, largely rattlesnake. It's responsible for more venomous snake bites than any other snake. Actually, that may not be true. The copperhead in the east might have more. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. It's certainly in the Southwest. It's responsible for more snake bites than anybody else. It's not because it has a bad attitude necessarily. It's more because it's common where a lot of people are common, so the chances for them to intersect each other is higher. A good way to tell the diamondbacks apart is the black and white bands on the tail are about the same size, whereas in the Mojave rattlesnake, which is another snake that occurs in some of the habitats where the diamondbacks are, the black bands are very thin compared to the white bands. The best thing is to not get that close where you have to figure it out. Let somebody else, no, I'm just kidding. Don't let anybody else, because you don't want to end up on the wrong end of a rattlesnake, that's for sure. So now now we're moving up the mountain. Alligator juniper, one of several species of juniper in the state. This one is very distinctive because its bark looks like the back of an alligator. If you've never seen one, look at the bark on an alligator juniper, and that's what an alligator's back looks like. Very sort of chunky. A small tree, usually, like a lot of these low elevation trees, 30, 40 feet is a pretty good sized one. And then in the same area where you see in this tree, you might, by the way, juniper is the flavoring agent in gin. And I was really surprised to hear that because I didn't think gin had any flavor, but that's what junipers taste like. You get Mexican blue oak. Now this is one of the first oaks to come into play. It's one of the low elevation ones. It has these sort of rounded leaves, oblong leaves, kind of has a bluish tinge to the leaves, a pretty easy oak to identify. Evergreen. Most of our oaks are evergreen, but they kind of look sickly like in the spring because even though they never shed all their leaves at once, they have a bunch of dead leaves and a bunch of green leaves coming in at the same time. And so they kind of look like they need some help, but that's just a normal course of events. They're doing perfectly fine. Now, if you're in the oak zone, you might be lucky and you might see this guy, the Arizona sister. This is obviously a butterfly. So a lot of insects, butterflies, moths, many beetles are very closely tied to certain plants, certain genera of plants, maybe some certain families of plants. If you like butterflies, it really helps to find out if you like looking through a field guide or you see a picture online or something. Oh, I really want to see a picture. I want to take a picture of that thing myself. Well, first of all, find out if it occurs where you are. That's a good step because if it lives in Florida and you're looking for it for here, you're probably going to not have very good luck. But if you're in the right area, find out what its caterpillars eat. And then find the plants. If you're in the oak woodlands, anywhere from the Mexican blue oak up into the Gamble oak zone, so several thousand feet of elevation, you will find this butterfly. That's because their caterpillars feed on oaks. They don't go to flowers very often. Actually a fair number of butterflies don't visit flowers very often, which kind of throws people a little bit. But this was at mud basically, and a lot of butterflies will but they're taking in salts that have been dissolved in the mud, and so they're often near water, so streams, creeks, puddles, that sort of thing. But again, caterpillars feed on oaks. If you want to see this butterfly, you have to get up to the oak zone. The next slide is another snake slide. So this is the Western black-tailed rattlesnake. This is they're really gorgeous snakes in my opinion. So this one overlaps with, it can be found occasionally in the lower Sonoran zone, like where saguaros are, that sort of thing. but they're often higher up. So where you start to see oaks and pines, that's where you'll find this snake. And then it's replaced yet again at higher elevations by other rattlesnakes. So this guy is, if you ever encounter one, these guys are pretty mellow. I kind of consider them like the surfer dudes of the rattlesnake world, because they're pretty mellow. The Mojaves are often not very mellow. The Western Diamondback sort of varies with the individuals, just like us, right? Some of us are cranky, some of us are not, and it's the same thing happens with the snakes. To give you an example, I was co-leading a trip with a couple of other guys. We were out in the Huachuca Mountains at night looking for owls. And if you ever do that, it's a lot of fun, but it'll be you and the owls and Border Patrol. That's who's going to be out there. And so we were coming back. It was about 10 o'clock at night. We were heading down the mountain, and we had a Western blacktail in the road. And so a lot of people wanted to see it, and they wanted to get pictures. So we stopped, and we had, I think, 2 vans, maybe 3 vans. And so everybody gets out, and they're taking pictures of the rattlesnake. And at first, when the headlights hit it, the rattlesnake kind of froze and said, this may not go well. But at least they stopped and didn't keep driving. And so it would sit there, and a bunch of people got photos, and it started to slither off. And one of the other guides was a gentleman named Bill Radke, and he's refuge manager for Leslie Canyon and San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuges in extreme southeastern Arizona. And he had his snake tongs with him, so he grabbed the snake and put him in the center road so more people could take photos. We did that 4 times, and the snake never rattled once. He probably then told all of his buddies, "It's like, you will not believe the day I'm having." So again, you don't want to mess with any rattlesnake, really, especially if you haven't been trained on like snake sticks and that sort of thing. But they don't all share the same disposition. These guys, in my view, are pretty mellow snakes. A bird you could see in the same area, these fantastic quail, the Montezuma quail, and males on the right, females on the left. And these are, in my opinion, these are the #1 regular breeding species of bird of southeastern Arizona that people come here to see. It used to be this colorful thing called the elegant trogon. Now I think it's this one, because these are just, even though they're technically more numerous, there's more individuals of them here, they're just harder to find. And you look at them, especially the male, you look at them, it's like, well, that's going to be easy as heck to find. They're not. What they'll do is they'll get behind it. This was in a road in the Huachuca Mountains. And what they did is they kind of walked off to the left, and they got behind a clump of grass, and they were literally 5 feet from us, and we couldn't see them. And, people are like, where did they go? I'm like, they're right over there. And they're like, but I don't see them. I don't either. They're right over there. How far away? Like 5 feet. It's like, what do you mean we can't see them from 5 feet? So even though it looks like they should be easy to find, they're really secretive. And but if you want to find them, oak juniper woodland is a good place to start. That's a really good habitat for them. The easiest way, I think, to find them is they find you. If you ever go out looking for them, more than likely you're going to strike out, because they're going to hear you coming, and they're going to slip off through the grass. And they may only be 5 feet from you, but you won't see them. Driving roads through the habitat is a good way to find them. Often what they'll do is, the first thing they'll do is they'll freeze, and they look like rocks. Think of a bowling ball with a head attached to it. That's kind of what their general comportment is. And they'll sit there. If you see the rocks starting to move, then it's either a Montezuma quail or there's an earthquake happening, and you'll probably know if it's an earthquake happening. But if you ever get a chance, they're really fantastic birds. If you ever see one, that's a good indication it's time to play Powerball. Another bird in the same general area, the wild turkeys. Wild turkeys are beautiful birds when the light hits them just right. They're kind of ungainly. The head's brightly colored, but it's a turkey head. But the plumage is actually brightly colored. But again, they're feeding a lot on acorns. So acorn woodpecker is called the acorn woodpecker for a reason. We're not often really good with names, but that's a pretty good one. So again, oak woodland, sometimes you can see them down where the junipers are, but normally they're up a little bit higher than that. Another bird in the same elevational zone is a hepatic tanager. Beautiful reddish bird with this sort of grayish cheek patch. I was down in the Santa Ritas today. We had a couple of them. This is, again, southwestern oak woodlands is where, that's what the field guides will say about them. Same area, you get the chipmunks. Chipmunks, so a lot of times people say they saw a chipmunk in the desert. They didn't. That's Harris's antelope squirrel, which is not a chipmunk. These are chipmunks. Chipmunks have stripes on the face. That's a good way to tell chipmunks apart from ground squirrels. The cliff chipmunk has these very thin, darker stripes on the back. Most chipmunks have much more distinguished stripes on the back, but again, oak woodlands, often near rocky outcrops. That's where they like to hang out. And then they also blend into the next higher zone where we start to see ponderosa pine, which is sometimes called yellow pine. And what's really interesting about this plant is it's sort of self-pruning. The lower branches, as these trees around it grow and they're more in shade, those branches eventually will stop growing needles and will eventually fall off. And ponderosa pine is one of those western trees that sort of evolved with fire. If the fire is not too intense, they do just fine. The problem has been that over the last century plus 125 years or so, we humans we think fire is bad because it burns down things we don't want it to burn down. Western forests evolved with fire. And so what's happened in the Yellowstone fire back in the late 80s kind of opened people's eyes to this. Western fires evolved with fire, and so they would burn low intensity fires every 5 to 10 years or so. It would burn the grasses, the forbs and things like that, and clear out the underbrush, and now you have a nice clean forest. But in that intervening time, all that stuff has grown up, has gotten much taller. And so now there's a lot of fuel. And so when fires do happen, they have a much higher potential to be catastrophic, meaning they'll get up in the crowns of the trees and they'll jump from one tree to another, and they cause a large amount of damage. And I like to tell people, he's kind of an icon. I hate to say this about him, but Smokey the Bear is kind of a fraud. We should prevent forest fires, but now we've created a sort of a mess of our own making because these fires, just too much fuel in western forests anymore. But and the ponderosa pines are suffering from that because now if these blazes that get, like the one in the Catalinas, the bighorn fire, it burned really hot in places such that it probably scorched all the seeds that were on the ground. It killed many of the living trees, and so that might be a wasteland for a while. But again, low intensity fires, these trees should do just fine. But now we're in an area, again, another little butterfly, the Chiricahua white. This doesn't make it up your way. It's kind of limited to a few mountain ranges near the border. This is a female. Now, hopefully you're realizing that's kind of a bad name for this butterfly because there's no white on it at all. And you would be correct in that. But the male has the white where the female has orange. And so the name, we could do a whole talk just on how poorly named things are. But there actually is some logic to this one. So these things, their caterpillars feed on pines, as does this species, the really beautiful satyr that occurs, again, up higher elevations, basically in the same ranges where the other species occur. So if you have insects that feed on pines, or if you have a bird like a pine siskin, it's got pine in its name, it's pretty good idea that the best places to find them where you see pines. And a lot of times the names, while some names are not very good, some names are just fine. So get up in the pine zone. Yarrow spiny lizard. This is a lizard that we see, again, where the pines start, higher elevation. It's very same genus as the desert spiny lizard, which we see in our backyards, but it does a couple of different things. Number one, our desert spiny lizard lays eggs. This species gives birth to live young. And that's because they live at a cold, if you're a reptile and you live at higher elevations, then the cold is a problem for you. And so by giving birth to live young, they are able to give their babies a head start so that they're more likely to survive their first winter. Also, they change their color dramatically. You see this a lot in the springtime, where if you go on a hike and you're in the right distributional range for Yarrow's spiny lizard, you'll see them in the morning and they're jet black. And that helps them warm up. And then as they warm up, the black sort of disappears and they get more colorful. And they have these green and blue and yellow tones on them. They're actually quite striking lizards. So even though they're closely related to our desert spiny lizard, which again is very common, that's one kind of has a spiny look to it, and they do the push-ups a lot of times, and they're around where prickly pear and barrel cactus and mesquite and stuff are. This is a very close relative, but it's evolved along a slightly different course because of the habitat it finds itself in. And so I think it's a pretty cool trick where we see this in horned lizards too. The species in the valleys and lower elevations tend to lay eggs, and their cousins at higher elevations tend to give birth to live young, and that's to sort of speed up their development. And I mentioned earlier that at higher elevations we get these montane, what are called the small montane rattlesnakes. And Arizona ridge-nosed rattlesnake is what to me is just a beautiful snake with that striking pattern on the face. This thing is the color of dead oak leaves, and so it sits on the ground and it really blends in well. That's one of the keys to rattlesnake survival, is to blend in. And these guys do that very, very well. And so this is one that you wouldn't see. Oak woodland up a little bit. It actually even gets replaced by a couple of other species up a little bit higher. But this is one you're not ever going to see, unless it's in a zoo. You're never going to see it in the valleys. It's up higher. So this is also a little bit different ecologically. It feeds a lot on lizards. And what they'll do is they'll, especially young ones, the young ones have a tail. So not the rattle itself, but this area of the body is often like a yellow or a peachy color. And what they'll do is they'll wave that tail back and forth. And the lizard's like, oh, that might be something I might want to eat. And they kind of come over, and the tables get turned very quickly. And instead of eating, they get eaten. And one theory for the evolution of the rattle holds that the rattle evolved as an extension of the brightly colored tail. So now you have bright colors and sound that enhances the display, right? So it brings that, what you're trying to attract, it brings closer to you. Another theory about the rattle is that they evolved to warn big ungulates like bison and back in the day, mammoths and things like that they were there, please don't step on me. It makes sense. I mean, both theories actually make sense. It kind of depends. No one knows for sure, actually, definitively how the rattle evolved. But a good way to figure it out is to look where the number of species is the greatest, because that's probably the area where that group evolved. And because more where you start, you don't spread out very far. The further away you get from that area, the fewer species. That's not always the way it works. There's a whole study called biogeography that looks at that. So it's not always true, but it's often a good indicator. And where rattlesnakes are most diverse is the Mexican plateau, where there are no big ungulates. So that might give more credence to the caudal luring hypothesis. But again, ultimately, we don't know. And there's also, I don't think I have them. If you get up even a little bit higher, there's the rock rattlesnake and the twin-spotted rattlesnake. Those are all three, these small montane rattlesnakes. And they're actually protected in the state because there's actually a black market on these small rattlesnakes, because their range in the US is basically confined to like a couple of counties in the United States. Mostly, to be honest, mostly Cochise and Pima. Cochise and Santa Cruz, I'm sorry. And then we get some really nice birds, western tanager. This is, again, they nest in the pine zone. So they're near the highest elevations, although they will migrate through lower elevation habitats. I've had western tanager in my yard. And I have mesquites and palo verdes and acacias, all that stuff, probably like you have in your yard. So these birds, they don't migrate from the top of one mountain to the top of the next. They go up one side and they go down the other, and they pass through the valleys and they go up again. So this is a bird that is more widespread on migration, but for breeding, it's only in the pine zone. And basically, migration is one of those events where kind of a lot of the regular rules kind of get thrown out the window, because they're just basically traveling from one area to another, and they're adopting the any port in the storm approach. If they can find some water, if they can find food, they'll stop and hang out for a while, even though they won't breed in that habitat. Another bird we get at these higher elevations is the red-faced warbler, another beautiful little bird. Again, it breeds up at high elevations in the pine zone. This one's a little bit different, though. This one tends to be more migratory from one mountain range to another. This one is not all that common at all in the valleys during the migration time, and it certainly doesn't breed in the valleys. So this one, even though it's breeding in the same habitat where you can find the previous species, its migration behavior is a little bit different. So migration is a whole complex phenomenon in its own right, and even though we say, well, this one's a migrant and this one's a migrant and this thing over here is a migrant and whales migrate and wildebeest migrate, it doesn't mean they're all doing the same thing. Yes, they are all migrating, but each one has their own sort of take on a very general theme. So just keep that in mind. And then we get this guy, the olive warbler. This is the worst named bird, I think, in the world, because it's not olive. It doesn't have an olive colored feather on it, and even better, it's not a warbler, and yet we call it the olive warbler. I give up. But this is a bird, again, the Western tanager is pretty widespread in the Western U.S. It actually goes quite a bit further to the east as well. Like the first one was discovered in Louisiana. So they're not as strictly like in Arizona as some of the other birds we talked about. Red-faced warbler, olive warbler, right up there with Montezuma quail. These are birds that people come here to see because their range in the U.S. is quite limited. The Sky Island ranges in southern Arizona and extreme southwestern New Mexico. And many of the ranges in New Mexico are actually on private land. So even though these birds are up there, their easiest access is on the public lands in southern Arizona. So that's why we get people come here literally from all over the world. And if you guys want to take it on as a group project to come up with a new name for this thing, go right ahead. It needs one. Mountain lions, this is again typically a higher elevation species. However, even that's not a universal trait, because like I mentioned with the deer, they will move between mountain ranges using washes, and they've been documented. So ADOT put in an underpass, a wildlife underpass and a wildlife overpass on Oracle Road, which leads from Tucson sort of towards Oracle and Catalina, so north of Tucson, southeast of you guys. And they put these overpasses because they redid the road and made it like 3 lanes in each direction. And it was a death zone for wildlife trying to cross it. So they put in an underpass and an overpass, and what they found is a lot of wildlife is using it, including mountain lions. So Oro Valley is not great habitat for a mountain lion, but they'll go from the Catalinas or the Tortolinas, which are north of the Catalinas, to these ranges to the west, and that's how they get there. They also will move to lower elevation with the fires. So, and that's not because they're migrating necessarily. It's more an artifact of they lost habitat. And a few years ago, after the Aspen fire, so this would have been 2003, there's a popular recreation area in northeastern Tucson called Sabino Canyon. And it's a really popular hiking area. It's beautiful. And there was a report that 2 mountain lions were, quote unquote, stalking people along this. There's a paved road you can run on and walk on and stuff. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. How did they know they were being stalked? Because, you know, how mountain lions and other big cats kind of make their living is not being found by the things they're stalking. So my guess, and this was, like I said, right after the Aspen fire. So my guess is that these two cats had wandered down because they had no more habitat, and Sabino Canyon has water in it, and there is a healthy population of small, and there are deer, there are javelina, there's also jackrabbits and regular rabbits and things like that. So I think they were sort of forced out by the fire, and they were just laying in the shade, and someone walked by and happened to see them and said, "Oh, they're stalking me," when in actuality they were just walking them walk past. And the mountain lion was probably like, "No, dude, I'm certainly not stalking you, because if I were, you wouldn't know it until I leapt onto you." So they are potentially a dangerous animal. They really, some places it seems like have a mountain lion issue. Arizona's not really one of them. There are occasional incidents. It's more like parts of California have issues with mountain lions. They're up there. If you ever see a mountain lion, that is certainly a day to play Powerball, because they're really good at not being seen. And so if you see one, make a lot of noise, make yourself look big. It helps if you see one in the winter, because you have your winter jacket on, because you can spread out. In winter for us, let's face it, it gets below 70 degrees. It's wintertime. So, we spread out. You want to make yourself look, you do not want to run, and you do not want to take your eyes off the cat. If you run, it's going to outrun you, and you probably won't like what could happen. But if you kind of keep, you can throw rocks in its general direction. I don't suggest throwing rocks at it, because if you bonk one off its forehead, it might get really mad. But if you throw it just so, you just want to kind of make yourself look like you're not worth the trouble, is basically what you're doing. I don't know if they have mountain lions in the superstitions or not. I wouldn't be surprised if they're up there. The American black bear, this is a very common large mammal in the Sky Islands. This one was in Madera Canyon. They're not very black here, so we might want to call this, I don't know, the cinnamon bear or something like that. Our black bears, many of the black bears in southern Arizona are brown, except for the head and the legs, which are black. Black bears are very widespread. They're similar to mountain lions. They're usually up in the mountains, but they can come down to lower elevations if the food supply is not very rich, or if they get displaced again by fires. And oftentimes you will also see young ones. So with all these skyline ranges, and basically any area where you have black bears, they're a very widespread species in North America. Anywhere you have black bears, very likely the habitat is saturated with black bears. So what happens is you have the young ones at the onset of the next breeding season usually get forced out. And so, they'll kind of wander around, and they're trying to find their little niche there. They might find a territory where maybe that resident male or female died for one reason or another. That's what they're looking for. They might be looking for an unoccupied territory, which is often somewhat marginal in its quality. That's why it's open. So you can see these guys moving around in the valleys, and people kind of freak out when they show up in towns and everything. But they're more or less moving again they're kind of displaced from one area, moving to another one. Black bears, I was about 20 feet from this guy when I took the photo. Black bears they're fairly timid animals, actually, except mama and her cubs. Everything's thrown out the window. You don't want to mess with mama and her cubs. And that's kind of true of a lot of mammals. And if you see one, again, you want to make yourself big. You don't want to run. You want to keep your eyes on him. He was actually getting a drink from a creek, and I was upwind from him, or downwind from him. He couldn't smell me, and I had this. Sometimes the voice in the back of the voice you hear in your head is worth listening to. And the voice in my head said, "Turn around." And so I'm like, that seemed a little bit urgent, so maybe I should turn around. And I did, and he was 5 feet from me. And he was down, he was sniffing in the creek bed, And I turned around and saw him, and he looked up and saw me, and our eyes both got really wide. And then he just kind of dashed. He went about 20 feet up a pretty steep hillside like it was nothing. And then he kind of walked parallel to me for a while. He's kind of grumbling, you know, son of a gun. I was nice creek bed and making me leave, and stupid humans, that sort of thing. And then he wandered off and everything was fine. But they are up, you know, these higher elevations. They can, again, make it down into these lower areas where they sometimes run afoul of us. The sad thing about black bears, or really any big mammal, is they often get labeled problem, quote unquote, problem bears. And most of the problem is with us, not with them. They're responding to opportunities we've presented for them, like food or something like that. So, you know, they're out there. They're actually fairly common. They're really beautiful, impressive mammals. Hopefully you get a chance to see one someday if you've not seen one, but you do want to be careful around them for sure. But they're using those, again, they're using those washes for highways. You get to the highest peaks, you get to these things like white firs, for example, that, again, if you were standing in Glacier National Park, you would probably have a lot of white firs around you, because this is about what's the elevation up there? 8,000, 9,000 feet, very similar to what you get at lower elevations in places like Montana, northern Idaho, that area. So it's very delightful in the summertime, because you get up there and it's 20, 25 degrees cooler than what you have in the valleys. But it's fairly harsh, especially in the wintertime, especially compared to what we sort of use on a daily basis. So in the higher elevations, a lot of times roads will be closed. Like, again, you know, the Catalinas, the Pinaleños, which was where Mount Graham is, and then the Chiricahuas, a lot of the roads to the higher elevations, the Forest Service closes during the wintertime, because it's just too much snow, not enough traffic going up there. Plus, they don't want to get stuck going up there and rescuing people, because I guarantee you that's what they would be doing a lot of, is rescuing people. You know, I wanted to go see the Chiricahuas in the snow, and I'm going to drive my Kia up there. And it's like, well, that's not going to work out real well. But if you get to the highest elevations, the tops of the peaks, you get these delightful birds like northern saw-whet owl, who are just cute as a button. You want to kind of put them in your pocket and take them home. They're up there. If it gets cold enough, I'm not going to get cold enough. If it gets enough snow where it's harder for them to catch their prey, they're feeding mostly on rodents, then they do occasionally come down to lower elevations in the wintertime, but they breed up, you know, high elevations here. Now, this is a bird that if you were to go north onto the Colorado Plateau, they become more widespread. But owls being owls, they're not real easy to find a lot of times. They kind of sit still during the daytime, and these guys often will sit pretty close to the tree trunk, so they look like a little broken off stub of a branch or something like that. But again, higher elevations is where you want to go to see them. And while you're up there looking for a northern saw-whet owl, you might get the red-breasted nuthatch. You can see in its scientific name, Canadensis, which means of Canada. That gives you a pretty good idea. Not, again, we talked about how bad names are sometimes, but this one's actually named pretty well. It gives you an idea of, from a U.S. perspective, that you have to get up higher elevations to see them. The white-breasted nuthatch, which doesn't have which more obviously white down here, doesn't have the white stripe above the eye. That one is the very widespread one. So this one actually replaces, this is the nuthatch. We have three nuthatches here in Arizona. The white-breasted at the lowest elevations, the pygmy nuthatch at middle elevations, and then the red-breasted at the top. But again, because none of this is clear-cut, I have seen all three of them in the same tree before, but that sort of thing doesn't really happen. That was in spring, and my guess is that the white-breasted nuthatches may have been moving around locally, and they just happen to find themselves up higher up in the mountains, whereas the pygmy nuthatch and red-breasted nuthatch tend to stay higher elevations year-round, unless things get really ugly as far as food goes, because in birds don't migrate, generally speaking, because they get cold. they have the best insulation covering their bodies. They don't care about, I mean, I have seen, nuthatches and pine siskins and chickadees in minus 30 degrees. I was inside, by the way. Minus 30 degrees, and they're out there. Oh, it's another great day, don't you think? Love the weather. And they're just really hardy. Many of these birds are. They migrate because the food source disappears. And so they think of a hummingbird. If it gets to be wintertime and you're in Washington State, you're up against it, right? So migration evolved from to take advantage of abundant seasonal food supplies, and then the option to leave when those food supplies disappear. So it doesn't really have anything to do with cold weather. We associate it with it because that's when it happens, but it also is when those food supplies tend to dry up and disappear. So that doesn't really have much to do at all with the cold weather. It's more of a food related thing. But that's, again, if you're, there's a couple of words I strongly urge you to not say ever. Always and never. Because there's always exceptions, and there's very few hard and fast truths when it comes to nature. So use things like usually or typically or seldom. That's a much more, you want to hedge your bets a little bit. Those are much more useful and actually factual words as well. So anyway, that is all the slides I had. I'd be very happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. Let me look in the chat. Bird slides are always appreciated. Thank you, Andrew. I agree. Even if you give a talk on, like, I don't know, cactus, throw in some bird slides. Keep everybody on their toes. So some of the animals, that we're going to see are like I said, are going to be up in your neck of the woods. Not all of them. Alpine areas, so the White Mountains, they have some animals there that we don't have here. So things like what used to be called the gray jay, now it's called the Canada jay, dusky grouse, Clark's nutcracker, which is a really we get them in southern Arizona rarely, but not very often. So the White Mountains, again, they're above the Mogollon Rim, and so they're a little bit different habitat, but their affinity is much more tied to what we see further north than what we see further south, like in our area. So there's Suzanne asked the question, are the specific numbers regarding precip and temp changes that occur with elevation gain consistent in other areas, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, with their changes in elevation, or is that specific to the mountains of southern Arizona? I would say that's more specific. Those sort of same changes happen, but as far as those numbers go, I think it's more strictly applied to southern Arizona. So Colorado, if you went from Denver to, say, the top, like Denver to Gunnison and then up to the top of Crested Butte, it's going to be, there are going to be changes in precip. There's going to be obviously changes in temperature, but those numbers may be different from the numbers we have here. I wouldn't feel confident one bit to say what happens in Colorado or Montana is the same as here. Here it's a little bit different because of our latitude. Latitude plays a lot in this because we tend to be warmer overall, even though the top of these highest peaks can get, the weather can get pretty ugly. To say that it's the same in Colorado would be a stretch, I would think. Oh, good, because I used to live at Crested Butte. For a couple of years, I was a ski bum, and I just randomly picked that. I'm actually surprised anybody knew what I was talking about. Gunnison and Crested Butte is kind of in southwestern Colorado. It's a great ski place if you're a skier. I highly recommend it. But I worked as a lift out there for a couple of years, and we went down to Gunnison that was our trip to the big city. They had a Walmart. Yeah, I love that area. Another snake story, if you have one. Oh, okay. So first of all, awesome, Rachel, that your 11-year-old son is listening, and hopefully I haven't bored him. But snakes are awesome animals. They get a bad rap. Snakes and spiders are kind of up against it just because of our perceptions of them. They're actually wonderful animals in their own right. But so it's kind of another. I have the one I'm picking. I have a few snake stories, but I was with a group. There's a place in northeastern Tucson called Agua Caliente Park, and it's got an artificial pond in it and palm trees, and we do a bunch of stuff out there. But we did a bunch of stuff before COVID happened. But I was with a group, and there was a bunch of cattails, and we were walking along, and I had a bunch of kids with me. We were doing the dragonfly thing, and so I'm looking like out, and I'm looking up to look for dragonflies. I'm not paying any attention to the ground. And so we're walking along, and all of a sudden, I put my foot down, and I was like, well, that was a lot squishier than it should have been. And I looked down, and I was stepping on the hind quarter of a Western diamondback. And luckily, and I have no idea why he didn't bite me, but I kind of did the snake dance. You can leap really high, higher than you would ever possibly think if you're stepping on a snake. But I leapt up, and the snake luckily crawled off. I probably scared it just as much as it scared me. And I landed. I landed eventually. I don't know how. I felt like I was up there for a while. But when I landed, the snake went off to the cattail, so nobody else was going to encounter it, and no one saw it, thank God. And so what I did is like, I'm just going to, you guys look around here. I'm going to look over here for a little bit. So I walked about 20 feet away and got my composure again, because your heart rate goes up really quick when that happens. And so what it taught me was to pay a lot more attention to the ground whenever you're out in southern Arizona. If you're in the state, especially from spring to fall, there's a very good chance there's a rattlesnake not too terribly far from you. So you have to be aware of them, and you don't have to fear them. They don't want any part of us, but you do have to respect them. And so that was another snake story. But I had a friend who was he was up in Tonto National Forest doing his, I think he was doing his master's work at the time. And he was going to his field site, and there was a trail he was on, had a big step down. And so there happened to be a tree there. So he grabbed onto the tree to steady himself. He had a big field pack on, loaded with stuff. And everyone knows, right, the rattlesnakes don't climb, except for this snake did not get that memo. And so he put his hand right on the snake, and the snake turned around and bit him on the wrist, actually. And so that snake obviously was more cranky than one I encountered. And he was mad because he was going to lose field time. That's the way these herpers think. They're great people. They're just a different breed altogether. But so he went back, and this is back probably mid to late 90s, when the anti-venom was based on horse serum, which is not the case anymore. It's different, bovine now. But anyway, a lot of people reacted negatively to the anti-venom because of the horse serum in it. And so what they used to do is give you a sensitivity test. And if you reacted to it, they wouldn't give you that stuff. And then so he knew he didn't want any part of that. So they treated him in the hospital for a couple of days, but he said it took 6 months for his arm to feel reasonably okay, and about a full year for him to feel like it did 5 seconds before the bite happened. So, you want to be aware out there. And so it's probably not going to kill you. Modern medicine, not many snake fatalities in the U.S. anymore, largely because, if you can get to a hospital and quick enough, that's the case. But you do have to be aware of them, because they're not going to did not get, they're not going to kill you. Well, hopefully not. But the best thing is not get bitten in the first place. And then you don't have to worry about any of this stuff. And you have to be, I mean, they could be in your yard, right? So I've done snake classes. I did a venomous snake class a while back, a couple months ago. And I tell people, even if it's simple as taking your trash out to the garbage can at night, take a flashlight or turn the light on, because there's no reason why a snake can't be there. And Kathy's right. That's why you do not wear flip-flops. I would actually, if I'm going to be in town, like on sidewalks or pavement, I'll wear flip-flops. But if you see these, and you'll see it. If you haven't seen it yet, you will. I guarantee it. You'll be doing an event, right? And you're going to be walking around out in the desert, and someone's going to show up in flip-flops, and you're like, "What are you doing, man?" I mean, besides the snakes, there's a lot of pokey things. It's really bad footwear. So, but it'll happen, guaranteed. Yeah, you want to be smart. Some people will get the gaiters, those snake chap things that kind of wrap around your lower leg. That's helpful. You don't have to buy them, but you know, it does help to pay attention. And nowadays, I know we've kind of gone off into here a little bit, but the one thing, most of the bites now are different from the bites that were historical. Not the snakes aren't any different, but where people are getting bitten. Because in the past, if you look at historical records from like you know, ranchers and cowboys and missionaries and things like that, most of the bites were on the lower extremity, the foot, the lower leg, and that's because people stepped on them, or they got really close to them and the snake defended itself. Nowadays, most of the bites are on the upper extremity because, well, this isn't going to be a shocker to most of you. I know. Most of the bites nowadays are young males, not a surprise, usually between about 17 and 30, often with alcohol involved. So if you do stupid things, you pay the consequences for stupid things. And so, so many of you sitting there have nothing to worry about because you're not even in the right demographic. In fact, I think probably everybody is in the right demographic not to worry about that. But if it's just, they're there. They're all around us. We just have to be aware of them, is really all it is. And yeah, I think a lot of times the last words before someone gets bitten is, "Hey, Bubba, hold my beer." And then if you hear that, just start calling 911 because it's inevitable that's going to happen. So let's see. Andrew, no, someone else. Who told about the dog? So Heather asked about the dog. There is a vaccine, or not a vaccine, an anti-venom for dogs. It's expensive. Someone mentioned in the chat, it's expensive for people too. There is rattlesnake avoidance training that you can do for your dog. It all depends on the dog. Some dogs are very smart and figure that out quickly. Other dogs, not so much, and may never figure it out. So you know your dog. It might be worth it if you think your dog will learn the lesson. It's not a fun thing to watch usually, because what they'll do is they'll put they'll start off with like a gopher snake sometimes, which is a non-venomous species. And so that's a good starting one because you can't get bitten. They'll put a collar on that gives them a shock, and it's not fun to watch if you're the pet owner. However, it does create other issues. And so my dog, I had this dog passed away not because of the rattlesnake bite, but this dog was about as smart as the table in front of me, and he got bitten on the head, and then he was acting a little weird. I mean, he was just sort of acting quite restless, and so I kind of was watching him, and he went right back to where the snake was. He luckily didn't get bitten the second time. We took him to the vet. Our neighbor their dog had been bitten a few times. So dogs seem, I should say this, medium-sized and large dogs seem to handle the rattlesnake venom better than people do. As far as they're going to swell up, they're going to be in pain, but they seem to get over more quickly. It's it's a tough issue. You know, it's one of those things that you need to be careful. I've talked to a couple of vets, and they both, one thing the vets are consistent with is they say it depends on the dog. If a lot of people, and Suzanne's mentioned this, that a lot of people think this is not the right approach. It's kind of that negative reinforcement psychology thought that they use. It's a tricky issue, but again, dogs often will end up getting bitten more frequently than people get bitten. But I don't know really. I mean, I know rattlesnake solutions. They'll put the fencing in your backyard, or you could do hardware cloth. Or if you have a fenced-in yard, you can put hardware cloth. You know, it's tall enough where the rattlesnakes generally don't go over it. You could sort of rattlesnake-proof your yard, and that greatly decreases the chances you'll get on. When I walk our dog, it's a different dog than the one that got bitten, but I keep him on a fairly short leash if I'm going to be in really good rattlesnake habitat. Because, you know, by the time, if he wanders off, you see a lot of leashes, those really long ones, which are great to give the dog some freedom, but there could be a snake there and the dog could get bitten before you even know there's a snake there, because the dog might be 15 feet away from you. So, but, you know, look, we're all dog owners, or many of us are dog owners. There's no universal solution to the rattlesnake issue. It's how, if you can find a vet, first of all, if you have a smart enough dog that you think is smart enough, and you can find a vet who will do it without the electric shock, then that might be something worth investigating for sure.
Excellent. Well, I want to take just a couple minutes to acknowledge, Jeff, if you had any kind of closing thoughts or last words of wisdom.
I know I've been talking way too long. First of all, thank you all for doing what you're doing. I applaud each and every one of you. I wish you nothing but the best going forward. The public in general is greatly misinformed about nature, and no agency has enough resources to get out there and talk to everybody. It's sort of a thing where you kind of are going to be filling that role for agent, you know, whatever agency you end up working for. And you, if you haven't had this happen yet, it will happen where you'll get a question and you'll be like, wow. But that will happen. So, you know, thank you on behalf of the master naturalists here in Tucson, who are kindred spirits with you guys. I know you heard talk about Lori Ann. Lori Ann's wonderful. So thank you for what you're doing. Whatever your interest is, follow it, whether it's snakes or plants or birds or, you know, whatever it is. Just follow that road as far as it will take you, and you will have a lot of fun in the process, and it will be awesome. And I wish you all the best. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure and an honor to speak with you. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, you can email me. I know Jenny and I think Nicole and Kim have my email address. They can give it to you. I also sent Kim. She can, you know, if you're interested in those resources, she can give you the information. The one, actually, I looked real quickly, the one that was published, I think in 1994, is still available on Amazon. I was thinking it was going to be out of print, but it's not. It's still out there. So enjoy the ride, man. It's a lot of fun. Just enjoy being outside with everybody, and do your best. Don't make anything up. If someone asks you a question you don't know the answer, do not make anything up, because you don't know, somebody else in the group might be a world expert on that thing, and you're going to make something up and it's going to throw everything else you said into doubt. So just say, I don't know. Those are 3 of the hardest words for many humans to speak. Say, I don't know. I'll try to figure it out. Give me your contact information and I'll try to get you an answer. But just enjoy. It's fun. And I applaud you all and thank you all for what you're doing. I hope to meet you all in person someday. But thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. And a round of applause. I'll do the clapping for all of us because you're all muted still.
But thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much. Jeff, you're more than welcome to stick around for our chapter meeting, business meeting if you want to, but you are under no duress to stick around for that.
I have, see, I'm on the field a lot. I have this problem. They have to drag me in and chain me to a chair. But have a wonderful business meeting. And maybe someday when all this virus stuff, we'll all have a beer together or something.
Yeah, that's my hope as well.
All right, take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a couple folks that I saw that dropped out who I think might have been here for just the advanced training. So if that's you and you want to take this moment to dip out of this meeting, then,